Moin, willkommen zurück zu einer weiteren Folge Dear Esther, Landmarks Edition. Hier sind wir ja letzte Folge stehen geblieben in dieser wunderhübschen Höhle und schauen mal, wie es heute hier weitergeht.
In a lot of ways, the caves were the hardest area of the game to actually write because we knew we didn't want to have much voiceover in there. I think because of the strength of the music, and this goes right back to the original mod, we wanted that to be the voice and for it to be a chance for Esther to speak rather than the narrator. And we also wanted to have this break so when the narrator came out from the caves, you had a real definite sense of something happening and that he had changed as a result of this journey. So it meant really felt wrong to have a lot of voiceover within there, but then that made it really difficult because then you had like 4 one-sentence lines in there and each one of those had to have an absolute clarity and to really kind of work. So I think for me, it was really interesting. It's like the difference between writing kind of fiction and writing poetry. When you read really amazing poets and you have that incredible surgical precision where every single word is considered and placed so absolutely. And rather than being able to kind of, because the narrator rambles quite naturally, you could kind of get into the flow of the narrator's ramble in other places in the level, and this was a real challenge because suddenly I was having to write like a poet of going every single one of these words, every single cadence, every single sound has to be absolutely perfect or it'll just feel like the narrator's voice is intruding on the rest of the experience. So it was, I think definitely the most challenging area of the game as a writer.
The sound here is a classic case of, again, what music I think does really well, which is you've had this soft, lyrical, beautiful, epic, dreamlike music, and then the moment you come out of the caves, you're into this really harsh soundscape, and the tonal shift is very brutal, I think, and deliberately so. You have very little music when you come out of the caves. You hear the wind, and it's a classic case of foreshadowing. So we know from this point that things are probably going to get bleaker, more difficult. And it's something that music does really well, I think, which is that emotional signalling and signposting.
Ein hübscher Ort nach dem nächsten hier. Davon brauche ich mal ein Screen. Nice. Oh, jetzt geht's wieder in so eine normalen Höhle über. Was steht da? Behold, Entdeckers.
This whole area moved, didn't it? The original mod, this was a cave right at the beginning of the caves where everything was written, and it moved to the back end of the level, and we have this long corridor that's full of these kind of it's the point of high madness, I think, in the game, isn't it?
Yeah, it's kind of just where you feel like you're losing the plot completely, both like visually and auditory, and you know, it's kind of like this really frenetic moment for me.
I think it's where you feel most that you're underneath the mountain, and you feel the weight of that mountain, and just I loved the idea when we were, putting through it of what would it actually take to do this, like to actually paint all these symbols and what is going on, and it really is quite an explicit kind of thing of madness of going, you would have to be insane or very, very disturbed to actually do this, and what is the process that this person's trying to work through, what they trying to achieve by this. And I think it really strengthened it, making it a crawl through a tunnel as opposed to just a static location.
Yeah, I think it's the consistency and the coherence of the symbols is a lot more broken down as well. Like you see some symbols before like scattered around the environments, but at this point they're like right in your face, and they're kind of it's just total madness, Any kind of meanings have been crossed over and confused, and, I think it really helps to bring the tension up at this point in the level as well. So you're kind of coming out of this dreamlike state a little bit.
Yeah, you kind of know that you're getting towards the end of the serenity into something that's a bit more disturbed than that. this is a bit more of a contentious one because we disagree on this one. I struggle with this. With the points in the caves where you duck above and below the water, and you have to have that transition of audio. And I love the audio on both sides of the surface tension of the water, but I really struggle with you breaking water because it's such a hard edge to the sound. And I don't think there's any other way around that. And you need to have those moments where you do go underwater because it's so important. But it's one of the areas that's never sat very comfortably with me because I feel like in a level which hasn't got a single edge in it, it's the one edge that breaks me.
And that's why I think it's so successful, because you've been lured into this completely hallucinatory, dreamlike world, and then all of a sudden, as a player, you're literally gasping for breath. You're coming up for air. And I think when we're talking about that metaphor of the body, for me, it's so about birth, and it's about this coming through the water, and actually it's a moment of realisation for me, but then you're having to go back under again and you're diving down. So for me, without wanting to sound incredibly pretentious, it's about the fight between the conscious and the subconscious and that struggle. Booyah!
There's actually a really interesting thing about that underwater section there, though, is that, I don't know if you remember, but you had a certain piece of music that plays when you're underwater, and to me, I really like that. It's kind of like, because at this point it's kind of like a very calm, relaxed type of a journey, and you go on the water and it starts to break apart a little bit, and it's almost like, that kind of psychosis is still there. It's not complete.
The motorway scene, the biggest new addition to between the mod and the commercial version. This didn't exist in the mod at all. It was a completely new thing.
Yeah, it's I wasn't sure where the idea spawned from to have this scene, whether I just sort of went off or we discussed it, or I can't remember.
I can't remember. Can you remember? It just kind of appeared, didn't it? And then
it was just this kind of. I think for me, actually, I remember being some technical difficulty between the drop and then coming out at the end part, but it was the same thing that we dealt with in the past of like, how do we not kill the player? From a technical standpoint, I think it might have been something to do that, but it was also, I can't remember where the whole thing came from.
I think it's my favourite point in the whole game, actually. I think it's just it's quite shocking, and it's so surreal, and it's so beautiful. And from an audio point of view, you have that baby's heartbeat bringing us back to the idea of the ultrasound. Was Esther pregnant? And it's one of those moments that I think everything just kind of collates together, and it's so unexpected.
Yeah, for me, it's like a moment of realization.
Yes.
It's like, it's coming to terms with something almost,
Whether or not what actually is going on at the moment is real, this did happen. There's kind of an absolute. I remember playtesting it, and I didn't know that the car can get switched out with a hospital gurney, and I must have played it. I was like 3 or 4 times into playtesting it. And the first time it switched out and it was a gurney instead, and I really remember kind of sitting there and going, "Oh God, that's just," and really being just stopped in my tracks by it. And it's one of those weird things you get when you're making a game that you'll never have those moments that a player does, where it all so well. It's really, really rare to be in a situation where you actually get a genuine, fresh player's eye view on what you're making.
Yeah, I was always a bit worried that it was maybe a bit too literal. Like we gone a bit too literal with that. But I think looking back at it now, there's still a lot of strangeness going on there. Obviously, the whole scene is unusual, but there's still these like very subtle details that are there that kind of still making you think, what does that mean? Like I think if you look closely, there's like coins scattered around and things like that. It's
And for me, it's, again, sorry to keep going on about it, but it's about layers of subconscious for me. That you start overground, you go into the caves, you go deeper, you're falling down, it's going down the rabbit hole effectively, and then you go to the deepest level, and that's actually the truth, that's the reality, that's what happened.
So the admission really is that I did play fast and loose with the geography of the M5. There isn't actually a welcome break services just outside the junction of Sanford, but we also know, players. I mean, what a thing if you make something that's based vaguely on something in real life. In terms of a compliment, when you're getting emails from players going, there isn't a welcome break there, and people really trying to work out where is this, and whole threads about where on the M5 it is. That's just the most amazing feeling. But I think what I really love about, what I think works really, really well in Esther, and again, it's something that I think is really carried forward to our other games, is that a lot of the time we're not dealing with kind of like big, glamorous, amazing, epic places. It's a sort of like a ratty little island in the Hebrides. It's someone who lived in Wolverhampton. It's just outside, a service station on a stretch of the M5. And I think that earths what's going on. Gives it a realness as well, particularly when you sort of put it against the surrealness of the caves. Actually, you're kind of going, this is really surreal and this is really, really dreamlike, but actually I'm talking about, a car accident just outside a little chef, and that playing off those two things against each other.
It's like making the ordinary extraordinary.
Absolutely, yeah.
Ein Autounfall. Deswegen haben wir da auch das Krankenbett mit den Münzen gesehen. Na gut, das Krankenbett da. Die Trage. Aber wo geht's jetzt hier weiter? Ach, hier ist eine unsichtbare Wand. Muss ich vielleicht doch auftauchen? Obwohl, ich bin ja da auch nicht weitergekommen. Ah. Jetzt sind wir wieder an der Höhle. Da, wo wir runtergefallen sind. Oh, das ist so einfach traumhaft hier. Aber die Story, die spielen wir auch noch danach.
This scene for me is like really, really iconic because it kind of brings this idea of the caves being an inward journey through the body together. It's really kind of like a symbol of rebirth, and it actually brings together a lot of the visual goals that I wanted to achieve with a lot of the symbolism in the game. Like, I've talked a little bit about how the environment was kind of designed to provoke emotions, and kind of the impressionistic style gives you just enough information to make you think of things and feel things. But this is probably like the antithesis of this, and the whole feeling of rebirth here is quite strong. I know Jess.
Yeah, the music's really supporting that.
Yeah,
because she sings always, always throughout. We've got always, always, and then she sings never, and a moment of absolute soaring. It's the climax of the music.
As you come out of the water and the music kind of swells, and you just kind of, it is like a moment of change has happened in some way, and I
think it's rebirth, isn't it? For me, it's his moment of clarity and acceptance and understanding of the reality of what's happened.
And you're literally moving towards the light at the end of the tunnel. You're actually doing that as you go through.
But the music, especially, I think before the music got layered in, that scene was nowhere near as kind of powerful for me. Like, that kind of just totally made it.
Geht's hier weiter? Ah. Schließe das Kapitel die Höhle ab. Dann sollten wir ja auch gleich hoffentlich wieder rauskommen. Oh, da sind wir durch. Da sind wir also durchgekommen. Oh, wir sind draußen.
Dan and I had worked on lots of projects together, non-game projects, before we made Dear Esther. And I think the thing that links all of the projects that we've worked on together is that idea of hidden stories and layers of stories. And one of the things I wanted to do with the music was to embed hidden little hints and stories into it. So the music that you hear here has Morse code. and the Morse code is spelling out the word Esther. And I really, really liked this concept of that some people would understand that it was Morse code and try and figure out what it was saying. It also provided a really interesting rhythmical dynamic. And yeah, it's just about these ideas of hidden stories and layers, but it also starts to emphasise the obsessional nature, I think, of the story in Dear Esther, and his agitation and actually slight panic. So you're getting this rhythm that just repeats and repeats and repeats obsessively. So I think even if you don't understand that it's saying Esther, and even if you don't understand that it's Morse code, you're still getting this feeling of this obsessional repetition and slight panic that he has. And again, it's kind of it's the new chapter, and it's spelling out that something has changed at this point.
It's probably the level which has changed most from the original mod. I think it's much, much bigger than the final level in the mod. One of the major changes in there was in the original mod, the whole side of the cliff face was covered in painting and writing, and a lot of that moved inside to that corridor in the caves where it's really obsessionally painted on. And it was really, we spent so long on that because we were trying to get it looking right, because it's one of those really interesting examples where I loved the image and the idea that you've got this guy painting the entire side of a mountain with words and symbols and things. But it was really interesting, when it went into the rebuild, it just never worked. And I think it was because the environment was so crude in the mod that those symbols and that painting became the focus of the level, and it changed the feeling of the level completely, when actually that just wasn't something we could realise in any way, that not even technically, but just didn't artistically look and feel right. And I think probably sort of retrospectively looking back on it, that's about the sort of the sophistication and the subtlety that then came into the art, rather than just being, this is literally just a canvas that we write words on, to actually the environment telling its own story without the story being literally painted on it.
Yeah, it was very difficult when we were experimenting with that to kind of like make it not completely unreal. Like, I think for me it was kind of, I wanted to kind of bring the player a little bit back into reality after the caves, and I think with having those symbols everywhere, it was kind of pushing them out a little bit. So I think what we came to, the kind of compromise we had, it was kind of a nice in-between.
Yeah, it didn't feel like a compromise to me. It felt it felt like it didn't work, but it kind of, but those symbols were coded. Like there's the hill in the background when you're standing right at the end of the boat and you look back, and you suddenly realise that the shape of the mountain is the shape of a woman lying on a side asleep. And that, I remember seeing it for the first time around and going, it's saying the same things, but it's saying it in a much, much, much subtler way than in the initial layer. But it was definitely challenging going back to how do you have a deep, complicated, subtle art style, but still manage to have something which is very sort of stark and symbolic laid over the top. It was much more challenging.
I think one of the most fascinating things for me about planning this director's commentary has been that in previous years, when all the three of us have talked about Dear Esther, we've talked about the interpretation of the player, but actually going through this together, post having made it, we're still surprising each other. Yeah, and I think that's really, really interesting for me, because it shows that we left interpretation for each other, and that we trusted each other actually just to get on with it. And because we each brought our own special and unique contribution to the game, we didn't have to, in a way, talk it to death or say, you have to justify every idea you have or talk it to death or explain it. That Rob's idea that the island is very tainted and corrupt, and my idea that Dan didn't know that the whole level of the caves is a birth metaphor. I think it's really amazing that we're still finding out things about the game that we didn't know.
I think it was nice when I came onto it, because Dan was basically like, he gave me a bunch of materials, but he left me to my own devices for a lot of it, and we kind of like, I'd finish the level and Dan would play it and give me some feedback, but he was very kind of like hands-off at the beginning, which was really nice, kind of. So a lot of my interpretations just came through that downtime where I was just kind of like going off and doing my own thing. And so yeah, it's like interesting to hear Dan talk about it sometimes, because like there's some backstory that I've never even considered before. And obviously hearing Jess talk about it as well is really interesting, especially when it comes to the soundtrack. It makes me look at things in a very different way. So yeah, it's really interesting.
I think for me, like making games is so inherently collaborative, and you have people coming together with different ideas and different takes on things. And in a way, the least interesting thing you can do with that is to structure it all so heavily that there's no space for each individual person to bring what they're thinking to it. And I think the best games, well, for me, my favourite games are ones where you can really feel the personal footprint of each individual developer and aspects of it, and it feels like it has been a genuinely collaborative exercise where everybody has thrown ideas into the mix and everybody is bringing something to the table rather than people are just following a kind of a really structured plan. So yeah, I think it probably is one of the reasons why Esther has had the sort of life it's had since release, is because there's 4 people if you include Nigel, all bringing very different things to it, and it gives it a huge amount of depth for something that's so simple on the surface. One of the really nice things about the move from mod to the commercial version is that we had a couple of years worth of the community talking about the game before we went back into it again. And one of the things that I read on a forum was that someone had constructed this amazing version of the story where they'd decided that the narrator was Paul. And I hadn't thought of that. It was never part of the original writing. And I thought, that's so amazing that as a writer, your audience can find something in what you're doing that you hadn't thought of. So it was really important when we went back in to record the additional set of voiceovers. I thought, I absolutely want to do this. I want to take this idea that's come out of the fans and to run with this and to add an entire new sort of stream of story in there. So we added in a couple of cues within the force level that intimated much more strongly that actually Paul wasn't this other character who caused the accident, but actually you were responsible for everything. But again, it was then trying to find that balance of not overcooking it, so you weren't led to that idea, but just if you happen to have the combination of just a couple of narrative units, then you would possibly come to that interpretation. But it was really amazing to be able to say, it felt like giving something back to the fans that had enabled us to make the remake in the first place, and it's always a lovely moment as a developer to be able to recognise your fan community and kind of say, thanks, this one's yours, this one's here for you.
I'd been on holiday to Greece lots of times, and one of the things that I always really responded to emotionally was those shrines that you see on the road, and sometimes they're dedicated to saints and sometimes they're to markate where an accident has taken place. So you'll get photos of the deceased person and flowers and candles, and it always really touched me. And so I said to Rob, I think it would be amazing to get these into the game somehow, and then Rob took that idea and ran with it, and I think they're so successful and they're so beautiful and they're really moving, and I think it's because you had this elemental scale. You have the island and it's huge and you have that scale, and all of a sudden you come around this corner and it's absolutely brought back to the human scale again and to that relationship of the individual. And I think the other thing that it does really successfully is it's a kind of magic realism, because there's no way that you could have all those amounts of candles lighting your way. Who's lit them? The island is empty. Who's put those shrines there? But I just think it's a really lovely bit of environmental storytelling, actually.
Okay. Was habe ich hier gerade gefunden? Irgendeine Urne. Nee, ich will nicht wieder ins Wasser. Da sterbe ich nur, leider. Und das möchte ich auch nicht. Komme ich hier durch? Nein, erste Fett. Oder RCS, keine Ahnung, was wir gerade spielen. So, da wieder rein, da rein, oder hier außen lang. Wir gehen erstmal hier rein. Was ist das? Hier haben wir wieder ein Bild. Mit Kerzen. Also wir haben ja schon gehört, wir hatten einen Autounfall. Aber wir werden ja nochmal die Story spielen und da werden wir ja wissen, worum es hier geht. Oh, da können wir nochmal in der Story reingehen. Ich glaube, da müssen wir hoch. Zum Signalturm.
What's fascinating to me, Dan, is that you're an atheist, but each of the 3 games that we've made are so strongly about religion, either the language or taking allegories and stories. Why are you so drawn to it?
I think I'm really interested in people and the stories that make up people. And I think there is like in the Bible, like most kind of religious texts, it's not about what it is, it's about what is behind what it is, and that's what you're really getting to, is the idea of the sort of the parable or the metaphor. And it really felt like, particularly with Paul on the road to Damascus, is a story that many people know and we can understand, and it's about redemption and consequence and guilt and transformation and who you really are and what that means. And it felt like just a really strong, powerful way of making it very accessible, the narrator's kind of inner turmoil, in a kind of a story that we know really well. And there's a universality to those kind of questions that, you know, whether it's, you know, Christianity, whether it's Islam, whether it's kind of Buddhism, that they're asking very broadly similar questions. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be a good person? How should we behave to each other? How should we feel about the world we're in? And it's a really powerful way of speaking to a lot of people. And I think that's always been really important as well, is that it's about saying, no matter who you are or what your kind of like outlook on life is, whether that's, you know, faith-based or secular, that we are all effectively asking the same questions. And that's why I think all our games kind of tend to be around those questions. Is Dear Esther a depressing game or a hopeful game?
For me, it's kind of like a mix of both, really. I think, like, my interpretation is kind of like, I always feel like kind of depressed when I think about the kind of turmoil that this guy's been going through for God knows how long, and the kind of environment he's been in, and, you know, all these events surrounding his story. But for me, I always feel like a little bit hopeful at the end. You know, the conclusion just feels like a relief, and like this is kind of all ended in some way. What do you think, Jess?
I think it's a game about acceptance, and I really like that. And I think it's telling that a lot of people with mental health issues have responded really positively to the game, and then we get a lot of emails and letters from those people saying that it's helped them through a really difficult time. And for me, that's because it's about the struggle of being human, that it's hard and that we love and that we grieve and we lose, but we come through it. And those things are what makes us human, that it's transformative and that the pain is part of life. And that's a really beautiful message. And I think that's what you do so well, Dan. That's what you write about. You write about what it is to be human. So, Dan, you wrote it.
Without wanting to cop out, one of the things about writing it that I really wanted to do was to make something that people could take and could own, and it would be their take on it, and that their interpretation of it mattered in a way that mine didn't. My job was to give them the architecture to interpret in their way. So
I think that is a cop-out. I do. I think as a writer you always have.
Yeah, I think it's redemptive. But I don't think the redemption is as cut and dried as it's all okay at the end. It's not okay at the end. But there is a release, there's an escape, that bad times will happen, but they will end. And they won't always end positively, but they will end. And that's I think, the redemption of it, of saying that things are never easy.
This too shall pass.
This too shall pass.
Which my mum always says, you know, and I think that's probably the motto of the Chinese Room, actually,
absolutely.
Isn't it?
Like, I don't think it's as kind of openly positive as, say, Rapture had a much more strongly positive end. I don't think Esther has. I think it's much greyer than that. But I think fundamentally it's about coming to terms. So, Dear Esther is the first walking simulator. How do you feel about Walking Simulator?
You know what, I think I took offence to it when it first became a thing. But I think actually I don't mind it so much now. I think the fact that we have kind of taken ownership over it, like that genre has been kind of made our own by not just our game, but like a bunch of different games have kind of embraced it. I don't know, what do you guys think?
I'm still really confused about the need to categorise in games, probably more than any other creative industry, and I think it shows that games have a long way to come in terms of how we describe an experience. So I do agree with Rob that it's really positive that we reclaimed walking simulator, but I still find it reductive, possibly, as a term. What about you, Dan?
I think for me it's people want to know what they're buying and what they're getting into, and I think it's so people understand what a walking simulator is now, in a way that if it was like first-person adventure or slow-moving, not very interactive, story-driven games, they're all sort of really very fluffy. But I think if you buy a game and someone says it's a walking simulator now, you've got a pretty good idea what you're getting. And there's been, there's Gone Home, Firewatch, Stanley Parable. There's so many other really good titles that kind of fall within that group of games out there now, that it does have an identity, and I think that's the really good thing about it. I mean, when Esther came out, there was literally nothing. We had no idea how we described it or what we called it.
We actually struggled with that quite a lot when it
came to marketing, and sort of ended up being sort of like a ghost story, because it felt like it was the closest thing we could get. But it feels like now you can make a game like this and you can say it's a walking simulator, and people will know what it is straight away.
Yeah, I think that's the nice thing, is there's a whole group of games out there now that quite comfortably put themselves into that category. And so it's like, if we were to come out before and just said it's a walking simulator, people would have been like, well, that sounds terribly boring. That doesn't. Why the hell would I play that? But now people kind of are a little bit.
Seek them out.
Yeah, now people are kind of familiar with what that means. The people out there who actually seek this sort of stuff out, and it's kind of really cool. I mean, me myself, I would actually do that, use that as a term to search. But yeah, I mean, it's a very simplified term for what our game is, and there's obviously a lot more to it than walking. But I think when you look at other genres, they're also kind of very simplified. First-person shooter, role-playing game. It's to me, it doesn't seem as bad as any of those other things.
There's a bit of an illusion of simplicity with games like Dear Esther that people kind of assume, because there's not a lot of mechanics and there's not much going on in that sense, that they're easy to make. And I think actually it's kind of the opposite in a way, that because they're so simple, everything is exposed and everything has to be exceptionally good for it to work, because you're carrying a player's experience on a fairly sparse, minimal kind of framework, and that really means that every aspect of it has to be produced at a really high quality and has to be done with a lot of passion and a lot of thought. There's nowhere to hide in a game like Esther, and that's something which I think carries through to the best games of this type. You can see with all of them there's a real commitment to kind of depth and a really intelligent way of approaching design, and a real kind of trust in the player and a real assumption that players are smart, imaginative people who want experiences. It's not a game that it's easy to just knock off or to do with any kind of lazy attitude. You have to be really, really passionate and care a great deal and put an awful lot of thought into it if it's going to work.
One of the things that I think was added more frequently in the final version of Dear Esther was the inclusion of a number of ghosts in the game. These are not like ghosts that you'd see in a normal horror game. They're just very loose silhouettes that you will see around the island, usually like quite a distance off, or just kind of somewhere that you'd barely see it out the corner of your eye. I think this is a good example of where it's kind of really in your face, and these are kind of just something that we put in to kind of not just bring some unreal elements to the island, but something supernatural as well, something that's kind of beyond this world, something kind of unsettling. And yeah, we've a lot of effort's been put in to make these things very subtle. I didn't really want them to be like, I didn't want it to be a ghost story, so to speak, but I just kind of wanted to bring some of this supernatural element into the game, and this area is probably one of the most prominent, because you can see it just before you go down into the gully here, and I think it's really one of my favourite scenes just because of it being so spooky, so unreal, and so interesting.
Hier stand aber, glaube ich, gerade noch jemand, sah von da so aus. Aber na gut.
The overlook, the point about this to me is that it's probably the voiceover in the game that kind of sums up the whole story and the experience. It's almost like a recap of everything that's gone before you start the final climb. And you know it's that pause before you're going to start the final climb and before the game's kind of builds to a climax. But you can also see the whole level, and it's like the idea that you are standing looking down on your own journey, a bit like the idea of your life flashing before your eyes, or sort of like seeing your body but having an out-of-body experience at the moment of death. And it was really designed to try and get that feeling as the player that you stop and you take stock of everything, and there's a bit of a sense of there's no going back. You take a breath and now it finishes. And I really wanted to kind of achieve that sort of sense, and I think we did. I think it really came together here, that you got that sense of going, right, now this ends, and now I move forwards to it.
Ah, schade, hier war nix. Nur noch mal eine weitere Kerze. So, dann machen wir uns mal auf den Weg zu dem Signalturm. Aber da haben wir noch ein bisschen vor uns, wenn man das so sieht. Und die Frage ist, kommen wir da überhaupt rein? Das ist die nächste Frage. Hier sind auch wieder Kerzen, die weisen mir den Weg. Ah Mann, ich hätte, glaube ich, zuvor die Story spielen sollen. Aber gut, man weiß es ja nicht vorher. Das weiß man alles nicht. Der Wind pfeift hier durch.
So here it kind of the environment becomes a little bit more surreal again. We kind of play with the colors a little bit, bring up the saturation. It's kind of a little bit of a return to some of the more cave-like aesthetics in terms of colors and stuff like that. And it's kind of there to kind of signpost another significant moment in the game, or something that's leading up to the significant moment. It goes back to this kind of idea of having these emotional signposts in the visuals of the game, without it being overly obvious. And some of that emotional stuff comes through just through the colors of the environment, and the more saturated they are, the more kind of surreal things become. So this is kind of like a turning point in the game. It's kind of like the final notice of you reaching the end.
The music that's playing here is a repeat of another cue, and originally we hear it played on the piano, and the string quartet take on the piece here. And it's one of those really nice instances where we were in the studio and I had this idea of how it was going to sound, and I thought it was going to be quite full and rich and, yeah, full-bodied. And then one of the string players said to me, this is wrong actually for what we're playing. And they said, let's strip out all the vibrato, let's play it in a really Scottish, plain style. And it absolutely transformed that piece, and it's one of the really special things about being a composer, is that you get to collaborate with people who come fresh to it. So you have this preconceived idea of how it should be, and then they say, no, why don't we turn it around and think about it like this? And it absolutely fits and works for that scene, because what we're getting at this point is a sense of fragility, of an ending, and it's almost reminiscent of a funeral procession. It's slow and it's dirge-like, but yeah, it was just a lovely moment where they gave something of themselves, and that's what's amazing about working with live instrumentalists. You're never going to get that from a sample.
It was possible that this last section of the game could have felt quite laborious and forced, because it's two long zigzagging paths that just go up, and there was a real importance to getting it right. Quite a lot of work went into it. I think at this point for me, you probably as a player understand that the narrator's going to die at the end, and that this is it. And that unlike where the rest of the island, there's this sense that this could just keep going on forever and ever and ever, and you're going to keep the motif of come back. But I think when you set on this path, we really wanted to have that sense of this is it. This is the last time you're going to walk these paths. This will end now, and that sort of idea of going, you're kind of climbing towards your death, but you're also moving towards a point where that glimpse in the caves where you see the motorway and you go, I understand what this is about. For me, the whole path up the side of the mountain is about saying, it's okay. It's that kind of starting to kind of release it and go, it's kind of okay that Esther died. It's kind of okay that the accident happened. I know that I'm going to die. I know that this is going to end. And I know that there's nowhere for me to go apart from follow this path, but that's all right. And it was very sort of hard to kind of try and find that subtle mix between the dread of it and the acceptance. It's where the positive and the negative and the kind of the loss and the redemption really start colliding for me. At least certainly that was what we were trying to achieve with it.
With the climb being quite a poignant moment of the game overall and of the story, it was quite a difficult task to try and make that climb still interesting and not too laborious, because it's kind of this zigzag up there with nothing really. There's no real environment. You just kind of have the sea on one side and the cliff face on the other. So there was quite a lot of work that went into kind of building up this feeling of tension as you're rising and kind of making this moment as poignant as possible while still making it interesting. So a lot of effort was put into building up this weather, building up the winds and the swaying of the grass and kind of the volume of the soundscapes and everything mixing together with the music and just kind of visually really trying to make this a tense moment. And I think it's hopefully been pulled off all right. And you'll notice when you get to the top, this kind of tension dies, and that's very purposeful. You'll see no more wind. It's just kind of like a symbolic thing where you're coming to the last moment, the point of no return. And that's been very deliberately designed.
Oh, das Wetter spielt verrückt. Dass man hier auch die Tore hört. Ein letzter Blick. Da unten sind wir lang gelaufen. Hier drunter sind wir raus. Und sind hier oben lang. Hier ist der Funkturm. Wind pfeift richtig heftig. Ich glaube, das wird das Ende, wie Sie schon gesagt haben.
We had a lot of debates, didn't we, about the ending of the game and whether the player should retain control or whether it was okay to go to a cutscene at this point. I personally don't mind it. I actually actively like it because I think it works really well as a metaphor for loss of control at that point. Dan, I know you're not as keen.
Yeah, I'm not. I would have loved the player not to have had control taken away from them, but to me it was a balance between two evils. The evil of having a cutscene and the evil of the player accidentally falling off the ladder halfway up and destroying the ending.
Yeah, I agree. I think we tried a few different things, and the tech at the time just wasn't, the ladder tech at the time just wasn't there, so and the other thing for me was pacing. It was making sure all the music, the voiceovers, the timings and everything were perfect for that final jump off point, and just letting the players kind of noodle around going up the ladder for what may have been like 7 minutes because it's a tall tower was kind of an impossible task.
One of the things that I enjoyed the most on working on Dear Esther was Rob's beautiful visuals were so inspiring, but Dan's words are always so amazing to write to. I think that's where we start as a partnership. And the music at the end was so easy to write because that last voiceover is the pinnacle of the writing to me, as it should be, because it's the last VO, so he would have failed if it wasn't good. But it is just so beautiful and moving. And for me, talking about whether it's a hopeful ending, the music is really hopeful at this point. And it signifies to me transformation, freedom, escape, acceptance. Yeah, and it was just a beautiful cue to write, actually.
I don't know, I can't remember quite where it came from in the mod, but the moment when we went, or we could put the bird in there, and you could see the bird's shadow, and actually it turned from being kind of like a straightforward literal suicide into a metaphorical, or to my mind, kind of like, I always really believed the narrator did turn into a bird just before they hit the ground, and that was really important. I think it's probably the strongest ending in any of our games so far. But yeah, I'm very proud of the way everything came together in that last section.
Yeah, I think it's the bird thing is particularly interesting because I think it was in the original mod, but the timings and everything were just all off, and you never really saw the seagull. Yeah, at least the shadow as well. It was all kind of like a little bit broken. And I remember when we went back in, I made a real effort to try and get that shadow just out of the center of the view, so you kind of have this hint of something happening, and I think you can hear the sound of a seagull flapping its wings. It's like very subtle, but like I say, I kind of really like the way that came together. It kind of it's very like say it's kind of like a release, but at the same time there's still this kind of ambiguity there that's kind of beautiful.
And I'm really proud that I got the monitor in at the end for ending of, it goes into the hospital monitor signifying the flat line. And I think it's one of those moments where you never want to be so clever that people notice it and it takes them out of the moment, but it just flows in through the music, and it just feels like everything comes together at that last point. That last VO, Rob's amazing visuals and the music, and it feels like a really, really strong and beautiful ending.
And then in the last second, Nigel Carrington's delivery of just those two words have come back, where he just pitch perfect.
Yeah.
Ja, das war's.
So that's the end of the director's commentary. We'd just like to say a big thank you to everyone for listening. We hope you've uncovered some secrets and some facts that you didn't know about the game before.
We'd also like to say a huge thank you for buying the game, and for all our fans who've been behind us and been behind the game and have kept it alive all these years. It's a real privilege that it's still out there, still such a title that people love so much.
Yeah, and we're really looking forward to the future and what we can create coming up next. Thanks for listening.
Cheers.
Bye.
So, aber wir haben da noch welche vergessen. Der Abspann kann ja nicht so lang sein, sind ja nicht so viele Leute. Ja, war schön, da was drüber zu erfahren. Ich hätte zwar erst die Story gespielt, aber naja, ich dachte, man hätte dann beides, aber nein, hat man leider nicht. Das ist ein bisschen schade. Aber naja, man kann nicht alles haben. Oh, das hättest du aber auch noch vertonen können, den Abspann. Also die Musik war auch faszinierend. Und die Umgebung, auch noch die Höhle und so. Aber ein bisschen gespoilert wurden wir ja schon über die Story, aber wie gesagt, ich lasse ein bisschen Zeit verstreichen und dann vergesse ich wieder ein bisschen was. Aber allzu viele haben sie auch nicht gesagt. Über die Story, nur wie sie alles gemacht haben und so. Finde ich schon nice, so eine Entwicklerkommentare und so. Ja, was ist jetzt? Development, Technical, Senior Producer, Quality. Ja, rödelst du hier? Die hätte doch noch eine Taste einbringen können zum Skippen. Made with Unity, Ultimate, FPS, Amplify Color, Dear System Play Marker, Copyright. Na gut, da haben wir es jetzt auch durch. Den Abspann. So, und jetzt komme ich ins Hauptmenü. Ja. Starten. Der Leuchtturm. Da haben wir ja noch welche vergessen.
Hello everyone, I'm Dan Pinchbeck, I'm the creative director of The Chinese Room, and this is the Dear Esther developers commentary.
Hi, I'm Rob Briscoe. I'm the artist of Dear Esther.
Ich jetzt nicht noch mal hören.
And I'm Jessica Curry, and I was the composer.
Die kennen wir ja alle schon.
So what you're looking at today is a remake of a remake of a
Hinten
mod.
am Strand
Dear Esther
und
started
da
off
hinten
in
bei so einer Höhle haben wir
2007 as a
noch was
Half-Life 2
vergessen.
mod that did really well in the modding community, which was fantastic, and as a result of that attracted the attention of
Da hinten,
Rob,
die haben wir auch
who
schon.
worked as the primary developer. Part of the point about the whole game, I think, was this idea that rather than having a linear, straight-through version of the story, that we could have multiple story units for each
So,
place you
noch ein
were,
bisschen
and I was
weiter
really
hier.
interested in this idea of how you can open up that space that people can interpret. So I loved the idea that you could have two people that
Ja,
played
das
this
kennen wir
game
schon.
and then would have a conversation about it, and one would
Denn
say,
ich glaube,
oh, what did you
den
think
hier
about
hatten
when
wir
this
noch und
happened?
den da
And the other
hinten
person would be like, well, that didn't happen for me. I had a
Oder ich hab ihn
completely different
verfilmt.
event happen. Or
When I wrote the music for the mod of Dear Esther, there was
Ja, dann sind wir
absolutely
hier
no
direkt hoch
budget whatsoever
und
for live players,
da war ja
so
schon der
all the
nächste.
music was sampled. But one of the good things about
sind
that
wir
is
ja
it
nicht mal
actually forced me
durchgelaufen.
to be quite creative about how I wrote the music. So with my
Und da war noch da
background
drüber
in
so eine
sound,
Höhle. So, das kennen wir noch nicht.
everything about Esther for me is a dream. The landscape is not an island, it's the dream of an island. The music is like music that you wake up because you've heard in your sleep, but you're not conscious of hearing it. And the language in the story was supposed to be like that as well. It didn't matter the sense it made, it was more about the kind of the shapes it created, if that makes sense. So that the words would kind of were like being in water, like listening to something underwater. It'd be this very dreamlike, symbolic, poetic thing, and it always had frustrated me in games with game writing. This has really changed quite a lot. There was never any space for poetic language. It was very exposition-y, very descriptive, very direct. And you'd have like art and audio would have these amazing creative spaces they could explore. But when it came down to actually writing, you just had to basically go into the room, describe the character, tell the player what to do. And it just seemed like the most boring thing you could do with words in a game. And why couldn't a writer have the same artistic freedom as a visual artist or an audio designer or a musician in terms of being able to say, isn't this just about creating this kind of emotional tone, this emotional space? And it's really, I still love that about the game. It's one of the things I love so much about Nigel's voiceover is it has this really odd, disconnected, kind of dreamlike quality to it, where you might finish the game and not actually understand anything that happened, but you'd been carried along in the flow of it. And without any kind of sarcasm at all, I get into trouble saying things like this. The same design principle applies as this to Halo. It's 30 seconds of fun, or 30 seconds of depressing engagement, I guess, in our case. But it is about that loop of being in the moment in the game constantly, and that's actually the critical thing that matters. This symbol on the beach, which is the golden ratio, it's one of the only things that's really left explicitly from the mod. In the original mod, there was an awful lot of more kind of symbols and kind of a much more kind of mystical, sort of magical element to the island. There was a lot of very weird stuff in there. And a lot of them came out of the commercial version because they felt like they were a little bit explicit. And instead, there's a lot more hidden kind of codes and symbols in there. There's still some stuff which you can only actually see or experience if you are not playing the game, if you're looking at it from editor. We had in the original mods things like trees planted to mirror the shape of the M5, or there's a whole bunch of things that are there to represent star clusters and all kinds of things like that. And we'll probably talk a bit more about kind of like hidden details and the secrets in the game as we go through. But that was really interesting for us in terms of the design of it, of going, you've got your conscious, explicit play experience, but games are always constantly manipulating your mood and your feelings and the decisions you're making. And so really trying to create a space that had all of these kind of subliminals in it was a really interesting thing that we wanted to do, both with the original, and then I think it got lifted up into a much more sophisticated version when we went to the commercial, because Rob was able to bring that sort of level of artistry to the visuals that really got that kind of sense of hidden meaning in there. And that was really important, given how kind of complex and symbol heavy and poetic the story is, where a lot of it doesn't actually make any sense, but it's about kind of leaving you with these, I guess, like the half-life of ideas and thoughts that you can't quite shake, that stay with you. So we really were trying to get that blend of how music, story and visuals could all create that really sort of uncanny structure that you wouldn't necessarily be able to define properly, but you knew it kind of had a meaning that was staying with you.
So something I wanted to do as an artist was create some kind of reward for the player when they explore the island. There are some areas of the game where it's a little bit more quieter, there's no music or there's no voiceovers. So I kind of wanted to create a bit of an incentive for people to explore. And you'll find around the island that these kind of like random scattered items that are usually slightly out of place from the environment themselves, but in another aspect they actually bring a little bit of story to the island itself, usually to the island or to the actual protagonists or you know, the characters that surround it. So you'll find around the island these little props and stuff. Just keep your eye out for it if you're exploring.
Okay. Da achten wir drauf. Und wir müssen jetzt noch einmal hier über diesen Hügel. Und dann holen wir uns auch noch die anderen da in der Höhle.
So people have asked why the Dear Esther's set on a Hebriden island. What's really interesting about this is one of those times when your kind of aspirations as an artist and the practical realities kind of dovetail. We knew that we had to have some way of limiting the player from disappearing off the play space, and when we made the original, it was a mod, and because it was a Half-Life 2 mod, you kind of had Eastern European city, spaceship, or blasted, desolate landscape, where you had three options if you didn't want to start making any other assets. So it started off with these
Ja, dann weiche ich ihn gerade aus.
One of the
Options. Nee,
things you're always trying to do as a composer
Können wir noch
is create
anlassen, da brauche ich die jetzt nicht
things.
extra auszuschalten.
And a slight confession is that probably the most
Aber da hinten
memorable
war das
theme,
Ziel,
which is
dieser Signalturm.
Remember in Dear Esther, wasn't actually created for the game. Rob's looking shocked. So it was actually from a piece of choral music that I'd written years before,
Und dann müssen wir ja auch schon
based on a
eigentlich bald
Christina
da
Rossetti
sein.
poem called Remember. And one of the things I was talking about earlier was how I didn't have any budget. So I had this piece of choral
Nee, hier
music,
war's noch nicht.
and I thought, hang on, this is absolutely
Noch ein
perfect for Esther.
Stückchen weiter.
But I don't want to use all of it. So the only bit that you actually get.
white lines.
Yeah.
They actually did this. It was really cool. I found this historical document. They used to do this on Bore and the Hebrides. If the disease broke out, they'd actually chip out and expose the
Ach so,
chalk.
da war das.
So if you're on a boat and you were coming to the island, you know not to land.
Ach so,
because
das
it was
haben wir von
infectious,
oben gesehen.
which is the coolest, most amazing. It's one of
Wir
those things
sind
where you
nach da
go.
abgebogen.
It's almost impossible as a writer to come up with something as
Und
cool as
nach da
that. It just
hinten,
has to
die
be
andere
something that's
Höhle, die
actually
habe ich
done,
mir
and it's
nicht
so
angeguckt.
sad as well. And I love this bit and the fact that we can do it because it
Wer weiß, vielleicht
it
geht's ja auch
feels
weiter.
really real because it references a real thing, and I can know there's
Vielleicht
something
wird das ja
really
zum
special about
gleichen
that.
Ziel.
But it was always one of those bits in the game that I thought we've got to be able to represent this somehow. We have to be able to
Aber
get
das
these
weiß
things
ich
in.
nicht.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. I actually didn't know that was actually based historically in
So,
real
da
life, but that's
hier
really
runter
cool.
und dann sind
Because
wir ja
I mean,
schon da.
my thing about the white lines is that it was kind of, it was this completely surreal thing, but also it was kind of, it just added to the landscape. It's like, whoa, what the hell is that?
So, da unten.
And putting that into the game was kind of challenging because to me it
Die
just seemed
Höhle,
like,
da waren wir
this
nicht
is
drinne.
it's going to be really hard to pull off in a way that's kind of realistic. But
Da
then when
bin
you
ich
look at the
abgebogen.
kind of art style of the game, it's not really a realistic thing. Like everything
Es war nach
is,
hier unten hin und dann war ich ja schon
half
da.
imagined. So in that way, it kind of really fit into the landscape, and it kind of creates this amazing sort
Mal
of
schauen, wo es
landmark
hingeht.
that you see in the environment, and I just found it really interesting to hear about that.
So, dann
I think it's
hier
one of those
durch.
things where it's not a realistic place. And I mean, no game is a realistic
Also
place
das
anyway.
hier habe
But
ich
one
ja,
of the things
glaube ich,
where
noch
understanding that
mitgenommen.
you're making something which isn't real and you have that kind of capacity to be sort of.
Oder?
I think the central question to the entire experience for most people that have
Ja,
played
den
it
haben
or
wir
are
noch
talking about it
mitgenommen.
is this idea of, is the island real? Is what's going on a literal event of a man
Das
walking
war nur
across a
eine
Scottish
normale
island?
Höhle.
Or is it a dream that he's had? Does the island even exist? And one of the things that we try to do with the
Licht.
writing is to constantly lull the player into a position where they got an understanding, they made a decision about what
Jo,
they
die
thought
hätte
was
ich noch
going on,
mal.
and then to undercut it. So you
Ja
never
gut, ich dachte,
actually
ich
were
hätte
able to
hier noch
settle
was,
on any one interpretation. And that was the challenge I set myself when I wrote the
Übersehen,
original
aber nee,
mod, was
dann
can
haben
we
wir
put a
alles.
story in a game that not only lends itself to multiple interpretations, but there is no stable interpretation. Every single interpretation you
Gut,
have.
dann würde ich sagen, dann war's das mit den Entwicklerkommentaren. Haut rein, Leute. Tschüss.